This lecture, I want to talk about Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, and Jeffersonian America, a second revolution. While we talked about Thomas Jefferson in the last video lecture, I do want to make you aware that I don't cover all the presidents because, well, the class would take forever, right? George Washington, we talked about last class. Following George Washington, John Adams would become president. John Adams, like George Washington, is a staunch Federalist, believes in a strong central government. Jefferson's different. And we talked about Jefferson in the last video class and throughout this module being the opposite of the Federalists, Washington and John Adams, but in particular Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury. And we went into detail last video class about that. But today we're going to focus on Thomas Jefferson and the Jeffersonian America, and under his presidency, how America will change. Now, before we go any further, I just want to refresh your memory regarding the world events, and in particular the French Revolution. If you remember, the French Revolution takes place several years after the American Revolution. It's kind of based on the same principles, a revolution against absolute power, i.e. royalty, and the king or the queen in some instances. Now, the French Revolution, while first admired by Americans such as George Washington, John Adams, and Alexander Hamilton, that admiration will soon turn when the French start to turn the revolution into more of a chaotic, violent revolution, a reign of terror. Now, all revolutions have some sort of violence, don't get me wrong, but I went into detail with their use of the guillotine and things such as that. Remember the guillotine, which beheaded many a French citizen during this reign of terror, this French Revolution, this chaos that will eventually morph into even more violence and more people losing their heads, will turn off the conservative Washington, John Adams, and Alexander Hamilton. While Thomas Jefferson, an adamant believer in the power of the people and that the people can do no wrong if educated properly, will still support the ideals of the French Revolution up until the end, where we all know a strong little man will take over and control the situation, and that Frenchman we know as Napoleon Bonaparte, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The background before Thomas Jefferson becomes president, the 1790s, George Washington is president, followed by John Adams, both staunch Federalists, which I've mentioned several times. The French Revolution is going on, and I've kind of gone into detail what's happening over there. We do see the emergence of two parties, political parties. We see the Federalists, and we see Jefferson and these anti-Federalists known as Democratic Republicans. Now, don't get bogged down on those terms, because I don't want you to think about political parties today. These are totally different animals. So they're just known as Democratic Republicans, these anti-Federalists like Thomas Jefferson, and Washington and John Adams are Federalists. In addition, there's always the threat of war with France and England. The United States, while we are a country at this point, we're not a very strong country. Don't even think of us in today's terms. We're very weak. We're brand new. Our military is not the envy of the world. So we're always worried about, the British coming back, or even the French who allied us during the American Revolution. They may want to try to influence, if not invade or take over the United States. So we're not a superpower by any means at this point. So this is the feeling during this time period before Jefferson. Something important, though, happens. George Washington, and I kind of mentioned in a prior lecture, that we always think of American heroes or the most important Americans. We throw George Washington out there. But I want you to know why we throw him out there as one of our first American heroes. Because a lot of times Americans just automatically say George Washington because he's the first president. But I want you to think more critically. While George Washington is not a perfect man, and most historical figures, if not all historical figures are not, he is president at a time where his popularity is high, where he could be president as long as he wanted. He could just keep on running, and in all honesty, he would be president for quite a while. He's elected and reelected, but George Washington does something which, of course, sets the precedent. And precedent means the way it's going to be in the past, which we always look to precedent, not president, but precedent. I know that's kind of weird. But what he will do is he will actually not run for reelection at some point, meaning he will step down after a term and let someone else be president. Think about that. George Washington, for all practical purposes, could be kind of the king of America, the king of the United States, if he wanted. He was that popular. But George Washington will transfer power during an election process to John Adams when John Adams wins the presidential election. This is very important. We have the first transfer of presidential political power. George Washington does not keep on running and running and winning and winning, thus kind of becoming a de facto king, right? So that's something I want to stress. We do see personal freedoms, especially under his vice president, later President John Adams during this time period. But it is our early American history that these actions have ramifications, and especially regarding that first presidency, which we went into more detail the last video class. Now, Thomas Jefferson will defeat John Adams, the president, at the time in 1800 to take the presidency in 1801. And in fact, Jefferson will be president from 1801 to 1825. Don't worry, class, I don't want you to memorize dates, but I just want to give you an idea of how long Jefferson will be president. And in fact, with Jefferson's election, once again, we see a president from the state of Virginia. And we'll see several presidents after Thomas Jefferson, also from Virginia, after Jefferson. James Madison and James Monroe. Don't have to worry about those gentlemen, those presidents. But we see a lot of our presidents, our early presidents from the state of Virginia, and this is known as a Virginia dynasty. Now, Jefferson and his supporters believe with the defeat of John Adams that Federalists and Federalists in general will attempt to lead America on a more democratic course. They had felt with the Federalists that it was more conservative. And in fact, since the Federalists never again will play a national political role after this defeat in 1800, most American voters of the era shared Jefferson's view. So the Federalists will go away. Now, conservatism will not, but the political party known as the Federalists, George Washington, John Adams, and others, think about Congress people and such, who may be Federalists. But after the election of Thomas Jefferson in 1800, we see the Federalist political party pretty much die out. With the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, we see this ideal, this Jeffersonian democracy that the United States starts to embrace, or Jefferson hopes they'll embrace. A Jeffersonian democracy refers to an American ideal as well as to a remarkably successful political movement. At the heart of both meanings of the term lies the household farm, worked on by ordinary families. So Jeffersonian democracy, the ideal is that household farm worked on by mom, dad, and the 18 kids. I joke. But the mom and dad and their children working the farm. Jeffersonian America marked a victory for the common farmers, as both the ideal embodiment of the American citizen and as a practical reality of who voted. As a result, Jeffersonian America required new Western farmlands to be cultivated as an absolute necessity for the future of the Republic. Because for this Jeffersonian democracy, farms and farmers working to make America better, the democracy that Thomas Jefferson envisions, what do farmers need, or future farmers need? They need land, right? They need a lot of land. And so this is key. This is key, that we need new Western farmlands to create this ideal democracy, this Jeffersonian democracy. Now, while I did mention that the Federalists had lost most political power after the defeat of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson winning the presidency in the 1790s, I do want you to know that the Federalists, they still remained an important force in American life and offered deep criticism of many of the Jeffersonian developments that Thomas Jefferson was trying to push through. In fact, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court throughout Thomas Jefferson's era, this being John Marshall, was an ardent Federalist. John Marshall, of course, the name of, if you're here in San Antonio, the Marshall High School is named after this Chief Justice. Now, Marshall was Supreme Court Chief Justice, and he's a political opponent because he does not have an elected office. Remember, Supreme Court justices are serving for their lifetime. They don't have to worry about being elected or being a politician. And in fact, Supreme Court Justice, John Marshall, will consistently support the supremacy of national power over the states, meaning Marshall, in his decisions with the Supreme Court, will consistently say that the federal government has power over the state government. So that's Federalist ideal, right? A strong central government. So John Marshall, as Supreme Court Justice, can always be a thorn in Thomas Jefferson's side because Marshall will consistently uphold any laws, or he'll interpret the Constitution, meaning the federal government has supremacy, is supreme, right, over any state government. Now, Thomas Jefferson's ideal America, this second revolution, this Jeffersonian democracy, has a serious flaw. The serious flaw of Jeffersonian America, however, came from its embracing of slavery. Now, Jefferson was a strong supporter and truly believed in the farmers of America, and the farmers' leaders. Now, the problem is the parties, these Democratic Republicans, the party of Thomas Jefferson, these leaders are slave owners, slave-owning elites, and they had no intention of including African Americans in their broadened commitment to democracy. Thomas Jefferson repeatedly will acknowledge that slavery is wrong, but he never saw a way to eliminate the institution of slavery. Jefferson's explanation of slaves within his perfect ideal Jeffersonian democracy of the farmer, his explanation regarding slavery within the Republic argued that African Americans have a racial inferiority and it barred them from becoming full and equal citizens. Very, very racist language, right? While he believes slavery is wrong, even Jefferson owns many, many slaves in his homestead of Monticello in Virginia. And in fact, one of the most famous examples or quotes that he gives, and I take a portion of it here on the slide, is to Jefferson, slavery was like holding a wolf by the ears. And if I just want you to think about that symbolism, that analogy, right? That you can't let go of slavery because it's going to bite you. It's too dangerous. You have to hold on to the wolf. So slavery kind of likens it to holding a wolf by the ears that you could never release because it was just too dangerous. And in fact, leaders and farmers in this new ideal Jeffersonian America, this Jeffersonian democracy, embrace slavery because remember, they're agriculture, they're Southern, and of course slavery is now key to their way of life, their economic, cultural, and other ways. Let's talk about the Louisiana Purchase. Thomas Jefferson's plans for a nation depended upon that Western expansion and access to international markets for American farm products. If you remember France during this time period, a little bit prior, of course, to the French Revolution, but we see one leader come out, and that of course, is Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon, leader of France, will threaten to block American access to the important port of New Orleans on the Mississippi River, which on this slide you have a map of. And you can see how the Mississippi River heads south and lets out in New Orleans. but that river is very important to American farmers. If you remember, American settlements west of the Appalachian Mountains depended upon river transport to get their goods to market, since overland trade to the east was expensive and impractical. President Jefferson considered changing his traditional foreign policy stance to an anti-French alliance with the British. But he'll also send diplomats to France to bargain for continued trade access with the along the Mississippi. And he'll send diplomats also to Britain, like I mentioned earlier, to pursue other policy options, maybe an alliance with Great Britain. So Thomas Jefferson is covering his bets, right? He's sending diplomats to Great Britain and to France and trying to figure out which is the best route for the United States. Can he make a deal with Napoleon? Or if he can't do that, can he make a deal with the British to kind of gang up on France? Now, James Monroe is the diplomat sent to France. Monroe is the top person negotiating in Paris, and he's empowered to purchase New Orleans and West Florida for between $2 and $10 million. Surprisingly, though, Napoleon will offer much, much more. Now, if you remember, Napoleon had overextended himself in his war against Britain. And what do wars need? They need money. Knowing full well that he could not force Americans out of the land France possessed in North America, which makes sense, right? Napoleon's across the world in Europe, and he knows he can't force Americans out. They're there already. So Napoleon offers to sell all of Louisiana to the U.S. for $15 million. This massive territory stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, and it will actually more than double the size of the United States. And in fact, this deal is struck in April of 1803. But the Louisiana Purchase brings a great deal of controversy. While American development in the 19th century depended on that western expansion that I mentioned, the controversial issues actually will eventually lead to the disunion of the United States. If we think about this, some New England Federalists, for example, began to talk of seceding from the U.S. since their political power was dramatically reduced by the purchase. And let me explain this a little bit more. When the United States more than doubles, and it's primarily to the south or southwest, right? That's primarily agriculture. And so we're get all this new land, which eventually, we all know, will eventually become territories and states. But of course, that's going to diminish the political power of those in the Northeast, in the New England areas. And furthermore, Jefferson, and this is important, I want you to remember this, Jefferson had clearly not followed his own strict interpretation of the Constitution. If you remember, we had brought up earlier the Jefferson and Hamilton. Hamilton believed in a strict interpretation, a loose interpretation. Hamilton was a loose interpretation of the Constitution, while Thomas Jefferson was strict. He said if it's not in the Constitution, the federal government cannot do it. Well, I want you to tell me where in the U.S. Constitution it says the president can purchase so much land from a foreign country without anyone's approval. It's not in there. Federalist critics howl that the Constitution nowhere permitted the federal government to purchase new land. Jefferson is troubled by his own inconsistency, but in the end, Jefferson decides that the Constitution's treaty-making provisions allowed him room to act on this. Yeah, he's just trying to find a reason behind his actions. Like I said, politicians, right? Once they get into office, they tend to change or flip-flop, is I think the term we use a lot. Jefferson, earlier lectures, right? Oh, if it's not in the Constitution, you can't do it. Hamilton, you can't do that bank because it's not in the Constitution. And now Jefferson has become president, and he's doing the exact same thing. He's making this agreement. He's doubling the size of the United States, and nowhere in the Constitution does it allow the government to make this purchase. Well, although it did contradict Thomas Jefferson's his ideals of the interpretation of the Constitution, it's a really, really good deal. Although $15 million seems like a small sum today, it's still a pretty good chunk of change back when this purchase is made. But it's still a good deal. 600 million acres purchased for less than 4 cents an acre. It's still a lot of money, but it's a great deal. The Louisiana Purchase demonstrates Jefferson's ability to make political decisions based on pragmatism, meaning, yeah, I know what I've said in the past, but this is too good a deal to pass up. But it also does some other things. It guarantees Western expansion, which is very important to Jefferson's overall vision that he took. Remember, Jeffersonian democracy, farmers need land. Well, the Louisiana Purchases does that. It creates a lot more land, and it dramatically increases the territory of our country. And eventually 13 new states will come to the Union based off of the territory gained during the purchase. In fact, in 1812, Louisiana will become the first state to join the Union from the land bought in this purchase. Well, Thomas Jefferson's purchase of Louisiana Territory with over 600 million acres was an economic and, I would argue, a political victory as well. And it avoided a possible war with the French when Napoleon Bonaparte satisfied